So yeah, thanks for joining this talk. Sorry for the technical issues. I hope that everything is good now. And yeah, hopefully after this talk, I will spike your interest a little bit, and you will continue to take a look into Svelte. So let's start. My name is Vlad Pupaza. I'm working for 8 years in the industry, and I have way too many hobbies for my own good. And what does that mean? I think that it means that this is kind of like a double-edged sword because I uh, I always look for new things, but I also quickly get bored of them. So in order to create a little bit of context, I'm gonna walk you guys through a short walk down to the history lane. This is practically things that I did, me and other colleagues of mine during the years. So yeah, I know that uh, this tend to be a little bit long, but I try to do my best. So hopefully I'll manage to do that. So first of all, everything started for me with HTML and CSS. It was a period where everyone needed a presentation site because we didn't have social media at that point. So that making a presentation site with just HTML and CSS was a quick way to get get some money out of it. After that, those sites suddenly needed to do more. So I started to use PHP because JavaScript was not up for it. After that, JavaScript got a new engine. It started to get some traction. Also, jQuery popped out, and I started to use it. And I started to tell myself that I'm an actual JavaScript programmer. And yeah, now I can see the irony in it. I don't know if you remember the times when everything was so animated on our websites and so flashy that by our current standards, you would actually need to show show a warning on the web page for epilepsy or something like that. Shortly after work, alongside with some colleagues, we started to build a framework because we suddenly noticed that JavaScript can be used for something that's actually related to programming. So yeah, uh, building a framework was kind of like a crazy night out. Really fun at the start, really fun during the building process, but with a killer hangover the next day. After that, we started to use Backbone because uh, I know after a decent amount of aspirin and water, we managed to beat that beast of a hangover from before. And yeah, we saw that people were building frameworks. They were doing most of the work. And instead of actually putting that effort into it, we were able to just use it. So that was neat. And by that, I think that this whole era of open source started. And yeah, we started to become a part of a larger community while taking and mostly not giving back. Uh, Shortly afterwards, we Flux and React started to come out, and yeah, this was quite interesting because as good as it sounds with Backbone, with people doing most of their work and we just using the framework, we still had some migraines, some really nasty ones at some points. And yeah, that's practically because our work was still way too complicated. So we needed something more simple. We needed to dumb it down a little bit. So instead of having an architecture that's all over the place, we started to have a flow of data that is just unidirectional, and that was amazing. That was amazing. And now the rendering before was complicated, but with Flux and React, you render everything at every single state change. And first, we thought that that was crazy because we were gonna kill the browser, but they said that we don't need to worry because they are doing some magic diffing behind the scenes, and it's going to actually add some performance boost to our old websites. And yeah, that was wow, and it was amazing. And I think that the hardest thing that we had to do uh, in this transition was to actually teach ourselves to think a little bit simpler. And I think that all of this transition was actually a good lesson to learn. Now, what happened afterwards? At some point, object-oriented CSS came out, and uh, we learned that we didn't know how to write CSS. And honestly, I don't know why that was such a surprise to us because we had a lot of issues with CSS. And normally we ended up with a ton of bugs in CSS related. Also during this time, more libraries started to pop out that were implementing the Flux architecture and were handling application state. So we got Redux and MobX. Also, closure scripts popped out in the community, and that was quite cool, but sadly, it didn't get any traction. Besides React, we also got Angular and Vue.js, but honestly, I wasn't working with Angular. I just played with it a little bit, and with Vue, uh, also in the same manner. But in my opinion, I think that these two are kind of doing, at this point at least, something quite similar with what React is doing. So yeah, what's the current state of things right now? So the trend is React and Redux. Uh, it's so mainstream that even if you try to pair React with something else than Redux, you'll have to explain a lot to everyone in your team and to clients and so on. Uh, and it's so mainstream that even people that have nothing to do with this are recommending you to use React and Redux. So yeah, what else do we have? As I said, in popularity, we also have Angular, but I think that the popularity on Angular project is slowing down a little bit over the years. And we also have Vue as alternative to React, but sincerely, I think that, as I said before, it's doing kind of the same thing, but just a little bit different, and it's probably more appealing to people that come from a specific background. So yeah, what's the conclusion of all of this? In my opinion, it works. It's fast enough, but it's boring. It's boring, and I think that we are kind of stuck. So my question is this it? Uh, I don't think so. It can be. I don't want to get back to that era where we were using just jQuery and we thought that we can do anything and we were actually doing programming. So we need to try something else. Now, in order to try something else, I'm going to try to talk to you a little bit about the AST. So what is the AST? It's practically the acronym of Abstract Syntax Tree. And the Abstract Syntax Tree is the result of parsing your code. And for JavaScript, the AST is a JavaScript object that contains the tree representation of your source. And in order to get the AST, you actually need to create it first. And for that, you can use a parser. And I posted here a link, a list of parsers. So you could use Esprima, you could use Babel, Shift, whatever you want. Basically, if you do a search on Google for JavaScript parsers. You'll find a ton of those. Um, you can also generate AST for TypeScript. It's a little bit different, but it works in the same with the same principles in mind. And since the AST can be a little bit confusing, and it also depends on the parser that you are using, you could use an AST Explorer to research the nodes and to get a clearer picture of how your code is structured. And let me show you a quick example of what can you see the screen? I hope so. So uh, basically, if you see here, we have just a little bit of code. And if we are looking to the EST Explorer, you can easily navigate and see what everything means in our code, each node, what section it represents, how are defined. So for example, for variable declaration, you can search for variable declaration, for function declaration, you can search for function declarations. And again, you can go into this deeper. So as I said, you could use something like this to analyze your code, to see how the parser is exporting the EST. And after that, you can navigate through this tree and you can do a lot of things, a lot of cool things with it. And let's see, why am I talking so much about EST and you guys are here for Svelte? So as I said, if you have an EST, you can analyze and manipulate your written code. By doing that, you could do a bunch of things. One of them is removing unused lines of code. If you can analyze, if you can iterate over your code structure, you can remove everything that's not used. You can invalidate some expressions. So if you, I don't know, if you want to remove parts of the code that are not in standard with a specific site, you can just remove them. You can impose new rules on your code. Besides that, you can even, I don't know, a friend of mine at a point tried to actually create unit tests based on some encountered function declaration in the code. So that's pretty nice, because think about it, if you could generate a big chunk of your unit test just by running a simple script in your console. And you can even create your own language, your own scripting language like this. Practically, you can take what you write and you can interpret that and you can output JavaScript, or if you are looking at another language. So that will kind of enable you to create a new language. And this is where Svelte slides in, because Svelte is a compiler-based framework. It's using the EST to do all of the magic under the hood. So instead of traditional frameworks, UI frameworks that we have that are more state-driven, and everything that is happening, all of their magic is done at runtime in the browser. Svelte is trying to do most of the work at build time, at compile time. And that way you kind of end up with with less load on the actual browser window. Now my question is, and this is something that we can try to answer at the end of the talk, where we will have the Q&A section, is Svelte even JavaScript anymore? Since it's using the AST and it's compiling all of your code and doing stuff with it behind the hood. Now, let's start talking more about Svelte, because 20 minutes are already out from this talk. Svelte was started by Rich Harris. I call him the Candyman because he makes a lot of jokes on Twitter and during his presentation. He's always saying that writing a tweet or saying somewhere that your framework is best in class in terms of performance is actually equal to saying Rich Harris 5 times in the window, and he will appear, he will take your code, and he will post a tweet, shortly post a tweet with everything done in Svelte and showing you that it's actually faster. Now, why Svelte? Uh, for First, we actually write less code. Uh, In Svelte, you are writing just HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So that means that you are actually halfway in your ramp up. So the learning curve and the way of adopting this into a new project is way smoother than other frameworks. You actually also write less code because Svelte is, instead of having class methods that you use to do specific operations, for example, state changes, like in React, you will actually use the language for that. Besides that, it's not using any kind of virtual DOM. And I'm not saying that the virtual DOM is bad, because to be honest, it's quite impressive. It does stuff pretty well. I was amazed when we actually switched to something that's using the virtual DOM, and even at this time and age, our sites are performant enough, but it still adds some load on the browser, because all of that magic diffing that is done under the hood uh, is practically made because we are still writing inefficient code. Yeah, we need something to save us from our inefficient code in order to keep our sites still blazing fast. So it's still an overhead that happens at runtime, an overhead that makes your site slower, and it just lets our inefficient code slide away under the rug. So Svelte is analyzing your code. Instead of using a virtual DOM, it's analyzing your code. It does some surgery on it, and what you end up uh, uh, in the browser is some pure vanilla JavaScript. So it's less overhead. You don't have to run a framework, and by that, it's faster. And besides that, it's also truly reactive. So you actually don't need to use a state managing library to have some reactivity in Svelte. Everything is built in the language, and you don't need to actually load another library on your page. You could just write your code. Svelte will pick up only the stuff that you actually need in the end page, and yeah, like that you just achieve reactivity. And we're going to talk more about reactivity further on. So why am I calling this, and why they are calling these cybernetically enhanced web apps? Because actually this is the terms that they are using on their web page. So if when you are writing code with Svelte, and when you are using this framework, you must think of you actually giving a set of instructions to the framework. And after that, your code is parsed. You get EST. Svelte is analyzing your EST. It's enhancing it. And when I say that it is enhancing it, Svelte is removing all of the code that you were written, but it's actually not used in your application. It's Besides that, it's not using all of its library. So for example, if you are using just 1% from the library, from Svelte, from the framework, it's gonna put only that piece of code into your final bundle. And besides that, uh, as I said, it's removing all of your unused code. So I'm talking about CSS and anything. And at the end of it, as I said, everything gets compiled into vanilla JS. So again, you don't need to run any kind of library in your browser before your app is starting. You've got just JavaScript, you load your bundles in small chunks, and your app is working. Now, how is Svelte handling CSS? So CSS in Svelte is automatically encapsulated and isolated. It's only returning the used style in your production code. So if I write, I don't know, a style for paragraphs and I'm not using any paragraphs in my code, that part of styling that I have written in my Git repository won't get into my production code. Uh, all of this styling can be done in Svelte without having to learn any new trick. So you just write plain old CSS, and it also works with preprocessors. So nothing is stopping you from actually using less or SAS. And you can even use CSS in JS, but I don't think that you actually need to. So for example, why are we using just CSS with Svelte instead of CSS in JS, even if CSS in JS is the modern standard in the industry right now? The thing is that we were using CSS in JS just to solve some problems, to solve some pain points that we had in our application. It's if Svelte is actually doing that for us, there's no point into adding an extra set of technology stack, extra functionality, and an extra load on the browser. So if we solve the problem just with plain CSS, I think that we are at the win. And also the learning curve is smaller because if you know CSS and if you're working in this industry, you should know CSS. You don't have to learn anything else. You don't have to learn style components. You don't have to learn JSS. So it's simpler. Now let's see how do we do it. We just need to add a style tag in our .svelte file where we write our component, and we just write the styles. Now, if you remember, I said before that besides preprocessors, you can also integrate, I think that even style components and other CSS in JS libraries with Svelte, but it's not recommended because that won't be analyzed as well as the rest of the code. And my recommendation is only to use it if it's actually needed. And of what I've used throughout so far, there was no need for anything like that. So as I said, you just have to have a style tag in our file. We write the styles, and after that, our paragraph is styled. Now let's get to writing components. How do we write a component in Svelte? It's quite simple. You just start writing some HTML in a .svelte file and you suddenly have your first component. How do we add data to our components? For that, we just need to include a script tag in our file where we write our JavaScript. And inside of there, we can use let and declare a variable, and after that we can use that variable in our components. And keep in mind that I said that Svelte is reactive, and Svelte is actually using the language itself to trigger state changes. So if anything changes the variable over here, name, also the component will be re-rendered with the new value. So practically just using the variable here already makes this reactive. Now let's look at dynamic attributes. The same, we add a script tag in our page. where we define some variables, and after that we just use the variables in the markup that we are writing. And we can also use the shorthand for this. So for example, we can just wrap uh, src, the source, in curly brackets, and right now we have an image with the path defined over here. Uh, we can also nest components in Svelte because we wouldn't want to add everything, all of the logic from our components in a single file, because Svelte is a UI framework, so it's kind of built around components. So let's say that we have a nested component that has just a paragraph in it. After that, we can also create a parent component where we import the nested component and we just use it here in the markup with the name that we are using for the import. And by that, our resulted HTML will contain both the parent and the nested component in it. If you guys are using, I don't know, React or templates or anything like that, I think that this is quite familiar. Now, Svelte also offers a set of logical blocks that we can use. And for that, we have conditional blocks. So basically, we could write an if statement like this in our markup from our Svelte files, Svelte components, and we can expose stuff to the HTML based on a condition. We can also loop and I don't know, create dynamically with these loop blocks markup, and we can also handle async code directly in our markup by using the async blocks. I think also that these are kind of familiar with the ones that were using templates in the past. Now, let's talk a little bit about reactivity. So I don't know if anyone is familiar what this actually is. The dollar sign and the two dots over here. Uh, for for me at least, I wasn't familiar with it. I never saw it in JavaScript ever, not in frameworks, not anywhere, and I didn't knew that it was actually valid JavaScript, and you could practically use something like this to create a labeled statement. Why is Svelte using this, utilizing this label statement? Because, as I said, we are parsing our code, so it still has to be valid. And it's not that used, so it was a kind of smart trick to implement into the framework in order to see what parts of the code are declared as reactive. And how are we doing reactivity? As I said before, uh, if we have declared the variable and if we use it, that means that we are already doing a reactive assignment to our code. So every time someone is changing this, this will also change. For example, if I had a button and with a callback on click, and I was clicking that, and I was incrementing the number of days, our code with each increment will trigger a re-render, and will re-render this set of markup over here. Another thing that you could do will be to utilize these label statements and create reactive declarations. What does that mean? For example, for people that are familiar with MobX or with observables, you may know that we have computed properties, computed values. So if we need in our application to have a state that is computed for another value from our application, so it's using another state to actually write and calculate the data, we can mark it as reactive code. And by that, every time that someone is changing days, this will also be recalculated, and your code that's using this reactive declaration, this variable will be re-rendered. And the third way that we can use reactivity instead is to create reactive statements. So again, this means that if someone is actually changing weeks in this example, I'm going to run this block and I'm going to do something that I have written in this code block. So for example, here, if the number of weeks is smaller than one, we are going to show an alert. And you can do this for with any kind of code, not just if blocks. Now let's get into using props, because as I said, we have components, we are nesting components. That means that we have to pass down props from the parent. How do we pass props? Uh, it's kind of similar with how we do it in React. We just write a property over here and we send a value in the parent. And now in the nested component file, in order to use that property, we just need to use the keyword export and define the property. After that, we can use it anywhere in that file and utilize the prop that's being passed down from the parent. And we can also write default values for that prop, of course. So in case you don't send anything, you will at least have a default. Now, we also need DOM events. For that, for example, we would need a handler in our code. And to actually listen to a DOM event, you just need to use on and specify the event, pass down the function. This is also reactive, so when we click, we don't need to call this function over here. It's going to be called automatically. And if I click this button, this callback will be triggered, and that way we can set event handlers for DOM events. We also have event modifiers, and what does that mean is that we can actually specify by using this syntax if we want to, I don't know, in this example, handle the click and trigger the callback only at the first click of this button. And the full list of modifiers that are available at the moment are prevent default, stop propagation, passive, captures, once, and self. And keep in mind that you can also chain modifiers. So for example, if you want to handle a click only once and you want to stop the propagation, you can use this same syntax here, and both of the modifiers will apply on this handler. Now, since we have components, you know that components have a life cycle, and everything starts from mounting the component and getting to a point where we are doing the cleanup and the component is destroyed. Now, as some of those you may know, we normally, not all of our code is that simple, that dumb, and sometimes we need to tap into this life cycle to do a specific set of operations. For example, I don't know, do an Ajax call before mounting and collect the data that our component is showing. For that, we can use onMount. Next, we also can use component composition as well. And how does this work? Well, we have slots, and this is the syntax for it. So basically, you can add a slot into I don't know, a component, a parent component, and from another component, when you render that component that has a slot in it, you can also pass another component that will occupy the place occupied by the slot over here. And you can also have named slots. So for example, in a component, we can have a slot with a name, and we can have multiple slots with a name. That means that we can pass components, compose components in any order that we want, and they will be arranged in the order that we have the slots in our markup. And of course, as you can see over here, you can also specify a default behavior for that slot. So if for example, in a use case, we forget to send a component or the data is not yet loaded and you just want to show a spinner, you can pass that as a default inside the slot. Once the data is loaded, instead of the slot, you will get the actual component that you want to render. Now we can also handle application state with something that's built directly in the framework, and for that we have the module stores. With this, we are able to create writable stores, readable store, and derivated stores. And yeah, if your app starts to become a little bit bigger, the need of having and maintaining application state that is used by multiple components will arise in your code, uh, in your workflow, and to do that, you could actually use the module that is available in Svelte. Now, writable stores are stores that can be written from outside of the components. Sorry, readable stores are something that cannot be written from outside of the components, and derivated, as the name says, it's if you want to create a store that is utilizing multiple stores. And besides all of this, there is a lot more in Svelte. So they also have element directives, and by directives, I'm talking about the ability to do bindings, trigger actions, toggle classes, stuff like that. They also have component directives built in. They also have a set of motions that are available in the Svelte motion module. They also have built-in and optimized transitions that you could use directly from Svelte by importing them from the Svelte transition. They also have animations that you can use in the same manner. They also offer a set of tags that you can use to do stuff related to the window, head, or body. So for example, if you want to catch all of the errors on the window, you would just use somewhere in your application the Svelte window, and you will attach an event to that, and that way you can listen to all of the events. Uh, we also have Svelte options. So as I said, Svelte is a compiler. It's doing most of the work, and it's preparing for rendering at the compile time instead of at runtime. But if you want to tweak that a little bit, you can use options, Svelte options, and you can do that only for specific components if you would like to. And besides this, they have a ton of other features built into Svelte. Also, keep in mind that if you're not using them, they won't get into your actual production code. Even if you import something in your file, but if you're not using it directly somewhere in the code where it has any kind of meaning or it's doing anything, it won't get into your production code. And from my point of view, that is quite amazing, because our bundles normally, even with tree shaking and such, they get way, way, way too big. Now let's see how we can start. Where can we start if we want to do something with Svelte? So Svelte offers a big set of examples. If you go to their website, and I also have a link in the presentation, they offer a big set of examples. As you can see over here, they offer examples for a ton of use cases that you can encounter in your application. And if we have time, we can play a little bit with some of this at the end. They also offer a handy playground. As you can see, you can actually write code over here, and everything will be done using Svelte, and you will actually see the result from the web page. You can inspect the JavaScript, CSS, and everything like that. Uh, they also offer an interactive tutorial on their site, so that is kind of a starting point for all of this because you can go through the flow and into most of what Svelte has to offer just by doing the tutorial. Again, it's done in a playground, so you don't have to do anything on your machine. You just go to the web page and you start interacting with and playing with Svelte. They offer SSR support with Sapper, and they also offer Svelte native. So if you want to use Svelte in order to create mobile applications in a similar manner how we have React Native, Svelte also has Svelte native. And how can we start a project? That's simple. You can either use npm digit to create your projects from a Svelte template, or you can go to the GitHub repository and clone your Svelte template. After that, you just install the node dependencies and you run the application and start programming for them from there. I think that this one is set up with rollup, but if you want to try to use Webpack, they also offer guidance on the web page on how to do that, and they have some community plugins made for it. They also offer TypeScript support. This was added recently. It doesn't mean that before we didn't had it, but didn't have it, but recently they released a new set of code and new update that offers way better TypeScript support with less pain and less configuration. And to do this, you create a repository, or you go to your old repository and fetch the code, and you just run the script for setup TypeScript, and the script will do everything for you. They also offer an extension for VS Code. Uh, and if you're using VS Code, you will be able to have things like syntax highlighting, all kinds of diagnostic messages. So for example, since this is AST, Svelte is using AST and it's a compiler, you can use this extension to actually get feedback for what CSS is unused in your code, what parts of code are unused, and you can remove them altogether from your code. It also has accessibility built in, and all kinds of other things like that, because they are analyzing your code, they are already enforcing a set of rules, and you can utilize that directly in your editor to keep your code cleaner and more performant and correct. And yeah, it also has TypeScript support, this extension, so you will be able to use everything that comes from that, syntax highlighting, and more. So, if you want to satisfy your curiosity more, you can go to the Svelte homepage uh, to check Svelte out. I also put a link here for the interactive tutorial, for the examples, for the Svelte playground. You could also check to see how Sapper works. If you think of Sapper, it's something more similar to Next.js and maybe Gatsby. Uh, it's still under development, but you could start to play with it and even contribute if you want to. I also posted the links to their blogs. They have some really nice articles there. Also, a link to a discussion on GitHub where people are talking about how Svelte is able to scale in large application, and also link to the Svelte community. So if you want to keep track of the events and so on, um, you could use that. Also link to the article where they announce the TypeScript improvements that were added to the Svelte, and also a link to the VS Code extension. Now, Before jumping to the Q&A, I just want to say that there's still a lot of work to be done with Svelte, and people are constantly working on it. So, for example, one thing that it's a little bit up in the air. It's not that you cannot do it. It's the the recommended way of handling unit tests. There are frameworks and there are extensions that you could use to write unit tests in Svelte for Svelte, but Rich Harris and the people that are working on Svelte are not recommending, don't have a recommended way right now in their tutorials to do that. And unit tests in Svelte are a little bit more tricky because you are working with compiled code. So that can be an issue sometimes, but there are some extensions and some frameworks that are doing this. Again, if you're looking for routing, they don't have a router like Vue.js does or other framework do. They don't have one built by themselves, but they will work on one. Until then, you have a lot of community options that you could use. And yeah, this was it. Tried to do it as fast as I could. And now let's see if we have any questions. And for that, I think that. So the first question is, how big is the community around Svelte? Are they ready-made modules for some of the common use cases that you can import in a new project? So yeah, the community is pretty big. I see that people are working on it. You have built-in components, packages like you have for other frameworks, or for example, if you need inputs and if you need buttons, forms, all kind of stuff like that. There are already packages with built-in components that are just ready to use, and those can be found on the community page. And yeah, it's a lot of people are working on it. From what I know, Svelte is getting more and more traction. I think that it's kind of targeting to be the fourth more common use framework, but don't quote me on that. I just saw a statistic somewhere. Maybe that's not the best one. But yeah, besides that, also Rich Harris created a YouTube channel where you could join talks that they have. They practically do a Q&A, an FAQ session from time to time. And the last one was 2 months ago or 1.5 months ago. So yeah, it has a community. A lot of people are working on it. You have already built-in components. You have routing alternatives, testing alternatives, packages that you could use, and is slowly getting some traction. Uh, the other question is it production ready? Have you used it in production? It is production ready. Svelte is, as I said before, I posted a link to a talk about it's actually a thread on GitHub about how well does Svelte scale. And from what people saw so far, with more and more components added to the page, Svelte starts with a smaller bundle than other frameworks, but slowly with more and more components, that bundle size can change and can become maybe bigger than other frameworks, for example, React, but I'm not talking about React by with us importing React in the page, but actually importing Preact, since that is smaller. But at the same time, you can do chunk splitting, and it's something that you should already do. So you will be able to keep your site fast with small chunks of code, and it scales okay in production. Now, if I have used it in production, I have used it, I haven't used it in a production environment for client or anything like that yet, sadly, to be honest. But I have used it in a project with a few friends. We built a chatbot with Svelte, and I'm also building a project on my own that's handling collections. So practically, it's going to be an app that you could use to create a history of your collection with prices and everything to it that you could use for insurance or stuff like that. But that's another story. Uh, Now, if you have any other questions, I don't see more in the Q&A panel. If you have any other questions regarding Svelte, you can reach out to me, and please also offer your feedback after this talk, and let me know what I can improve. I bet that there are a lot of things. So yeah, I'm really happy and always excited to read your feedback. I see that we still have 2 more minutes. It's not a lot, and if we don't get any other questions, I'll keep the window open. In case we do, we can actually play a little bit with some examples. So, thank you, thank you, thank you. So let's see. As I said, if you already have a variable declaration, and by the way, you have to use let for that, this will become already reactive. So as you can see, if I write anything here, our component will be re-rendered and everything will work correctly. Same thing for dynamic attributes. If I change this, it won't work anymore because it won't find the source. Now, also, let me see if I can do this. As I said, it has accessibility built into it. While Svelte is compiling everything, it will analyze your code. And with an extension or in the playground, you can also already see this kind of information. You also can also style things. So if I write red over here, it will get there. This is the output, and let me show you. For example, if I add a new style, but I'm not using it anywhere in the application, it won't get into the CSS output that we are using in production. You can also have nested components. So here we have a nested components, and let me change something there. And you will be already able to see the change, and you can use it like this. And yeah, you can also, another functionality that is built into Svelte. So for example, if you receive from the platform, from CMS, if you receive a big chunk of HTML that you just want to push into the application, you can use the HTML tag anywhere in your component, and you just pass that as a string, and it will be rendered in your application. Again, reactive assignments, reactive declarations. So for example, if I click this button, as you can see, this is reactive. You don't have to do anything. You don't have to set any states or anything like that. You just use this label statement to let the compiler framework know that this is reactive, and you can, and that's it. You don't have to use, I don't know, any class functions, any decorators or stuff like that that we are using right now. And this is working somehow similar or of how the Excel, the spreadsheets are working, because those are an example of something that's actually reactive. Can also have reactive statements, can declare props, and you can see how we use it here. So if I change the value over here, it will get down to the prop, to the nested component, and it will get used here, and so on. I really encourage you guys to play a little bit with Svelte because they made it so easy, and yeah, it's pretty simple to get into it without having to do anything to any kind of setup on your machine. I think it even works on mobile. This kind of playgrounds. Now the tutorial, it's interactive. It's with a set of indications. You will have to fix the code, or you can ask for advice. They also have an API page and a playground if you want to start creating your small Svelte application in the browser without doing anything, and you can even log in to save. So yeah, that was it. We are 2 minutes over the schedule. I want to thank you guys again for being here, and I hope that I made you more curious and you will start looking into Svelte or even other things, and we will manage to get over uh, this bump that we are facing now, where we are kind of using the same things for years and years. Thanks again, and yeah, talk to you later if you have any other comments or questions. Thank you.